UN and its partners have just launched an early recovery strategy for 2024 to 2028 to support building long-term resilience and address the ongoing humanitarian crisis in the country. And let me also flag the critical importance of the active engagement of sanctioning states to mitigate any adverse effects of sanctions, particularly in the form of overcompliance. Let me also welcome the government of Syria's decision to extend for a further 3-month permission for the UN to use Bab al-Salam and Al-Ra'i border crossings, which remains critical to reach those in need in northwest Syria. Mr. President, Syria remains in a profound and active state of war and division. Many millions of Syrians are still outside their country or struggling to survive in a complex landscape of de facto authorities, foreign armies, armed non-state actors, and listed terrorist groups. Over 100,000 remain arbitrarily detained or missing. The economy is in tatters and infrastructure is destroyed and degraded. Organized crime and illicit activities are on the rise, with negative social impact and generating even further instability. After almost 14 years of war and conflict, there are no quick fix technocratic solutions to these challenges, which are deeply political. These challenges also speak to the direct involvement as well as security concerns of regional and international players. Tackling these issues requires a meaningful political process in line with Security Council Resolution 2254. This is a pivotal moment to move the political process forward with genuine commitment and action. Geopolitical winds may soon start shifting once again in directions that are hard to predict. If all sides signal regions to act constructively, responsibly, and practically, then we have the best chance to harness existing and new dynamics into opportunities for progress. What does this mean in practice? One signal would be the resumption of constitutional committee meeting. The special envoy had in-depth discussion on this during the Astana talks and in the region, and looks forward to consultations with the Syrian government in the coming days, and also with the opposition Syrian Negotiation Commission. This will send a clear message that the framework for the political process remains alive and operational, and that there is a Syrian government and opposition whose nominees are able to sit together and address the critical issues at the heart of the intra-Syrian conflict. Another signal could be to further develop step-for-step confidence-building measures in light of the ideas on the table and bearing in mind the development on the ground and diplomatically. But at this moment, all Syrian and international players can and should really be thinking bigger, sending a signal that they are willing to put all the critical issues and concerns on the table. The Syrian political issues at the heart of conflict, but also the issues pertaining to protection, sovereignty, security, economy and sanctions, detainees and missing, refugees and so on, issues which can only be fully addressed with external players. The Special Envoy has been sharing ideas on how to develop a comprehensive path out of these conflicts. Engagement on these ideas will be a strong signal at a time of potential change that a negotiated political solution on Syria in line with Resolution 2254 is not beyond our collective ingenuity and political will. Mr. President, we of course will continue our engagement with Syrian civil society. As you heard from a civil society support room participant last month on behalf of many Syrian civil society actors, and as we keep hearing from the Women's Advisory Board too, there is a strong desire within Syrian communities for a political process that brings genuine reconciliation. Civil society must have a voice in that process. Here, let me once again encourage all Syrian parties to ensure that Syrian women have a seat at the table. This remains a key element in building a resilient peace and sustainable future for Syria, as we heard in the recent Security Council session on women building peace in a changing environment. Mr. President, in closing, let me reiterate the Special Envoy's appeal to all parties to de-escalate the military situation, both in the region and within Syria, and prioritize the protection and support of Syrian civilians, including those crossing back. We also call on Syrian and international stakeholders to work with the Special Envoy to reinvigorate the political process and also demonstrate a readiness to engage on the full scope of issues necessary for a comprehensive resolution. This is a time of profound uncertainty and danger in the region. It is also exactly the time to shape a path to allow the Syrian people to realize their legitimate aspirations, to restore Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity, and to safeguard peace and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Rushdie for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Edem Osunu.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, today I will address three key issues. First, the ongoing humanitarian impact on Syria of escalating regional conflict, including the continued influx of people from Lebanon. Second, the compounding effect on existing humanitarian needs and pressures at a time when over two-thirds of people in Syria are already in need of vital humanitarian assistance. And third, the heightened need for humanitarian funding and working in ways that maximize resources. Since I last briefed the Security Council in October, hostilities in Lebanon have continued to drive thousands of people across the border into Syria every day. We welcome the ongoing willingness of the government of Syria to keep its borders open and facilitate their entry. At the same time, continued airstrikes along the border have made this crossing more dangerous and challenging, as you've just heard from the Deputy Special Envoy. Damage from airstrikes means that vehicles can no longer traverse 2 of the 5 official border crossings. This includes the main Dedet Yabuz crossing in rural Damascus, through which half of the arrivals to date have come, and the UCA crossings in Homs. People, including women, children, and other vulnerable groups, have resorted to navigating the crossing on foot or seeking out longer and riskier alternative routes. Airstrikes near the UCA border crossing in Al-Qusair have landed close to UNHCR facilities and in one case damaged the UNHCR border post at UCA. Another strike in the Shamsin area damaged the Damascus-Homs road. Civilian casualties also continue to be reported from ongoing strikes in various parts of the country, including residential areas. These strikes are also complicating aid efforts. The movement of aid workers have been scaled back, particularly to parts of Homs. The damage to border crossings has forced trucks to take longer routes, contributing to increased costs for commodities. Ongoing hostilities have also affected people's movement and response efforts in other locations. An NGO worker, for example, was injured in hostilities in Aleppo Governorate. It is critical to take all feasible precautions to avoid civilian harm, including to aid workers. Mr. President, in total, more than 540,000 people have now reportedly fled to Syria from Lebanon since late September, more than 500,000 people. An estimated two-thirds are Syrian. More than half of this number are children. Over 7,000 are pregnant women, and about 40% of arriving households are headed by women. The key needs of those arriving to date include food, household items, shelter, health assistance, protection, and legal support. United Nations agencies are working alongside the Syrian Arab Crescent, Red Crescent, and other partners to provide their basic needs at the border and at places of onward movement. Our colleagues from UNHCR, as the Deputy Special Envoy has said as well, are monitoring and assessing those in need. However, since the launch of the $324 million UNHCR-led interagency appeal in early October, we have received only $55 million, or that's what's projected in the pipeline. Humanitarians are doing what we can, including with existing resources on hand. But this is not sustainable in a country where 16.7 million people, more than 70% of the population, are already in need of assistance. While we welcome the contributions made to date, while we are grateful to donors for their generosity, we urge donors to step forward with more funding. There are already reports of some Lebanese families returning to Lebanon due to lack of services and poor living conditions in Syria. UNHCR is continuing to monitor the situation, which further illustrates the impossible decisions displaced people are often faced with. Mr. President, more than 100,000 people have arrived in the northeast of Syria. This is adding to needs in a region where 3/4 of the population already requires humanitarian assistance and where conflict and other drivers of needs continue. Late last month, an escalation in hostilities in the northeast killed or injured dozens of civilians. Damage to civilian infrastructure disrupted access to water, electricity, and fuel for hundreds of thousands of people. And several humanitarian partners were forced to temporarily suspend their activities. The region is also facing an emerging outbreak of suspected cholera, with over 270 suspected cases and 1 death reported to date in the northeast. Many of these cases are in Al-Hol camp, where tens of thousands of people, again, most of them women and children, are living in crowded detention-like conditions. The lack of adequate testing facilities in Al-Hasaka, along with declining resources for health services, poses a serious risk to containing the cholera outbreak. Meanwhile, an estimated 7,800 people fleeing Lebanon have arrived in northwest Syria, where needs, displacement, and civilian casualties are already high as a result of hostilities. Mr. President, members of the Council, already facing staggering levels of need and overstretched humanitarian services, host communities are pressed even further. Our partners have described a family in Homs that was already facing severe food insecurity, hosting some 20 family members who have fled Lebanon. Or a classroom in Aleppo, designed for up to 45 students, now overflowing with more than 70 children. These are communities where humanitarian assistance has already had to be dramatically scaled back. Funding for the humanitarian response plan stands at only 28%, and about 2 million fewer people are receiving critical aid each month now, more than a year ago. The impact on food security is particularly alarming. Nearly 13 million people already facing food insecurity in Syria. This is the 5th highest total globally, while the WFP has been forced to reduce its assistance by 80% in the past 2 years due to funding cuts. Worryingly, the latest Hunger Hotspots report issued by the World Food Programme and the Food and Agricultural Organization identifies Syria as a country of very high concern among the 12 countries most at risk for further deteriorating conditions in the coming 6 months. As the resident and humanitarian coordinator for Syria and the regional humanitarian for the Syria crisis warned in a joint statement last week, unless more funding is received, consequences will be dire. More funding is needed to help some 2.5 million people withstand the winter months which are setting in. The situation is particularly serious for displaced people in camps and informal sites. In northwest Syria, some 1.4 million internally displaced persons require urgent assistance, including 730,000 people still living in tents. Again, women and children who make up majority of these people stand to suffer the most. Without additional funding, respiratory infections and hospitalizations are likely to surge, particularly among young children, even as health assistance has been scaled back. And millions of children will lose out on school due to lack of heating. Mr. President, the serious limitations on resources have make direct and efficient humanitarian assistance via all available routes even more essential. In this regard, I welcome the government of Syria's extension of permission, as the Deputy Special Envoy also highlighted, for the United Nations to use Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai crossings to deliver assistance from Türkiye to northwest Syria until 13 February 2025. The cross-border operation is a critical lifeline for nearly 1 million people a month in Idlib and northern Aleppo. Funding shortfalls also reinforce the importance of strengthened investments in early recovery assistance under the Humanitarian Response Plan and the new early recovery strategy. For example, investing in rehabilitating irrigation systems will allow for greater food production and expand agricultural livelihoods. Critical, given this year's wheat harvest is expected to be nearly 50% below the pre-crisis level. Critical also because of the food insecurity numbers I shared earlier. Similar interventions are needed in health, water, education, and energy sectors, all of which have been decimated by years of conflict and crisis. Finally, Mr. President, the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Syria underlines the importance of sustained progress towards peace in Syria and across the region. We once again urge for support for the Special Envoy Pedersen's efforts to facilitate a political solution in Syria, an essential step towards ending this decade-long humanitarian crisis and enabling the people of Syria to rebuild their lives and restore hope for a better future. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Wazornu for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Sosan Abu Zainuddin.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, 13 years ago, we, brave Syrian women and men, took to the streets claiming what's rightfully ours, a say in how we live and how our country is governed. Our message was clear. Syria
is ours, and it is not the property of the Assad family.
13 years on, thousands continue to demonstrate in the streets of Sweda, undeterred by intimidations. For over a year now, they have been asserting that Syria is ours and is not the property of the Assad family, or, for that matter, any of the de facto authorities that have emerged in the past 13 years. Protesters in Idlib, Aleppo, Qamishli, and Deir ez-Zor, and beyond echo this sentiment. In the years between these two moments, hundreds of thousands of us have been killed. Tens of thousands forcibly disappeared or tortured to death, and millions have been displaced. Those who remain live in a fragmented Syria, ruled by de facto authorities, including that of the Assad regime, who rules by force and not by legitimacy. But I'm not here today to recount atrocities you know very well, nor am I here to steer your emotions or appeal to your sense of humanity. We are beyond that. I am here today to say that we are invincible, even in the face of your contentious politics. And I'm going to explain why and propose that we leverage this determination to break the political deadlock that we all face. Members of the Council, let's speak accountability. When Russia and China vetoed this Council's resolution to refer Syria to the International Criminal Court in 2014, we persisted. We found creative workaround to the limitations imposed by this Council's political dynamics. Our documentation and advocacy led to the creation of the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the first UN accountability mechanism of its kind. And this paved the way for all of us to use universal jurisdiction to pursue accountability. Thanks to the relentless efforts of Syrian victims, survivors, and human rights defenders, including women-led groups, today, perpetrators are facing trials in the courts of the world, in Sweden, in Germany, in France, in the US, and in the UK. And thanks to the same efforts, the Netherlands and Canada brought Syria to the International Court of Justice. And members of the Council, exactly a year ago, in November 2023, the ICJ issued a landmark ruling demanding Syria end torture, a call the regime has blatantly ignored. And as Syrians stood outside the ICJ that day demanding accountability, they were still fighting for the creation of the independent institution on missing persons, for their right to truth and justice. And yes, they did have the General Assembly establishing that last year. On chemical weapons, a crime that shocked the world, we didn't give up either. Despite Russia's repeated vetoes, our determination to seek justice remains persistent. In fact, tomorrow in The Hague, Syrian civil society will host members of the international community in our second conference on chemical weapons, where we will highlight progress in this regard. Our collective efforts, the collective efforts of Syrian victims, survivors, and human rights defenders have led to two historic developments. First, the international arrest warrants for Bashar al-Assad and others, holding them accountable for their role in the use of chemical weapons in Syria. This marks the first ever warrant issued by a foreign court against a sitting head of state for war crimes and crimes against humanity, a groundbreaking precedent. And second, the first of its kind working group to advance proposals for criminal accountability for chemical weapon use, consisting of states from nearly every region of the world coming together to say no to impunity. Members of the Council, the political dynamics have also hindered access for millions of Syrians to aid, but not our will to act. After last year's earthquakes, it took a week for the UN to secure the Syrian government's permission and approval to open border crossings into northwest Syria. An entire week, when every second counted. During that critical time, our own white helmets, alongside tens of humanitarian Syrian organizations and voluntary groups, were the only responders. We did our utmost when the United Nations of this world hesitated, despite legal scholars affirming that it had the authority under international law. But politics prevailed. And then came the Russian vetoes to end cross-border aid altogether, pushing the UN to a consent-based model, granting the Syrian regime power over aid delivery across Syria. This is a regime with a track record of deadly sieges, of obstructing cross-line aid, of tampering with humanitarian convoys, stripping them of life-saving medical supplies. A regime notorious for its innovative methods of aid diversion has been, in practice, granted a de facto veto power over Syrians' right to humanitarian assistance by this Council's politics. So yes, it is all politics. Yet, on the one issue that requires political resolve and diplomatic ingenuity, this Council remains paralyzed. Members of the Council, I'm speaking of Resolution 2254. For 13 years, the international community has complicitly politicized every technical aspect of the Syrian conflict, empowering the regime and leading Syria into a political stalemate. Meanwhile, it has depoliticized the conflict root causes, fueling calls to normalize with this narcotic regime under the guise of pragmatism and humanitarian necessity. Resolution 2254, born in this very chamber in 2015, has been systematically undermined by your passive approach to the conflict's political core. Let's not forget, Syria's conflict did not emerge from a vacuum. It began with a regime massacring its own people, the same regime you're thanking today for opening borders and crossing points. Today, the political process is stalled, reduced to a futile constitutional path, and worse, it's diluted by multiple trajectories regionally and internationally to normalize with the regime. But it's in this context that Madaniya came into being, a collective of over 200 organizations with members and representatives present with me here today, working across all regions inside Syria and across all sectors, inside Syria and the diaspora, and coming together to reclaim political agency to our civic space. Not to replace any of the Syrian bodies engaged in the political process, but to assert our rightful role as civic actors in shaping the political future of our country. And to propose that we use all leverage to incentivize a genuine political solution. Members of the Council, two files, early recovery and refugee return, are critical here. While sustainable aid through early recovery is overdue, entrusting the Syrian regime with it undermines efforts for political progress. You are tampering with power dynamics on the ground. You are supposed to be exerting pressures on the regime to cooperate in the political process, not granting it critical files to fortify its grip of power over the lives of Syrians. Early recovery should build the foundations of a principled state, not restore a criminal regime. Support must invest in building and bridging local institutional infrastructure, including that of Syrian civil society, across all regions, based on a human rights conditionality, to rebuild Syria as a whole on a foundation of sovereignty and national ownership claimed by its own people, not by regimes who hold power through the rule of repression and violence. Similarly, refugee return must be voluntary, safe, and dignified. Yet, some member states misrepresent forced displacement as voluntary returns, portraying Syria as safe and using displacement as a tool for normalization. Those fleeing Israeli attacks in Lebanon or deported from neighboring countries are not returning home. They are being forcibly displaced. This demands a nuanced response, ensuring support and protection to those in need while addressing the root causes to create conditions for a voluntary return. And how so? By incentivizing the political process. Members of the Council, I will leave you with three messages. First, stop tampering with power dynamics through your passive political approaches. Your inaction is undermining Resolution 2254, empowering war criminals and worsening the situation, not just for us, but for the region, the international order, and ultimately for you. Second, leverage technical files to incentivize political progress. Demand irreversible concessions that can push the political process forward. Aid and accountability have been politicized to empower the Syrian regime for long. It's time that you ask how they can be used to shift power dynamics in favor of the Syrian people. And finally, work with us. We are the stakeholders in the future of Syria. We are the future of Syria. Any political settlement that's concluded at our expense, that denies our rights and dignity, will inevitably fail, because we will not rest until we claim back our state of citizenship and democracy.
I thank Ms. Abu Zainuddin for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I start my statement, I would like to express deep regret that the UK presidency, with the neo-colonial spirit that is present in London, sought deliberately to politicize our debate. This is a direct provocation. By inviting a rapporteur who is just putting forward a purely complex, phantom-like thoughts about the situation regarding her compatriots, people who are successfully living their lives in peace under the leadership and control of the Damascus authorities. We have had an excellent opportunity to believe that this particular rapporteur has no understanding whatsoever of what is currently going on in Syria. This is a gross lack of respect for the members of the Council, and it's a disdain for the principles that should underpin the work of the UN Security Council. We would like to express our sincere protest against this, and we are going to ask for explanations. And also, we would urge you not to forget that the Security Council of the United Nations is not one's own area where there is impunity reigning, or a family that can just push forward the views of the Anglo-Saxons alone. So, pushing forward the views of these blinded Anglo-Saxon colonials. We would like to thank the Deputy Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, Najat Roshdi, and the Director of the OCHA for their view of the political and humanitarian situation in the Syrian Arab Republic. We have to note with regret that Syria, our friendly country, is increasingly finding itself dragged into an expanded confrontation in the area of the Arab-Israeli conflict. This has been confirmed by what we have just heard from the reports today. The Israel Defense Forces are continuing to carry out intensive, indiscriminate strikes on civilian infrastructure, including on homes. On the 20th of November, at least 36 people died and more than 50 people were injured as a result of the Israeli strike on Syrian Palmyra. As a result of the air raid of the Israeli Air Forces on the 14th and 15th of November in the region of the capital, Meza, and the outskirts of Quds, 15 Syrians died, including women and children, and 16 were injured. It is lamentable that as part of their comprehensive support for Western Jerusalem, the US is harnessing its military contingents in the areas across the Euphrates and at Tav, areas that are illegally, they're illegally there under the excuse of fighting terrorism. The bleak prospects for this fight are further worsened by the approaches taken by Western countries to the situation in Idlib that is under the control of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham terrorists. This is a listed group by the UN Security Council. Washington's policy to maintain its de facto occupation of broad areas in the northeast of Syria and the plundering of its oil, gas and agricultural resources is leading to a worsening of the socio-economic situation and a stepping up of the extremist underground in the Syrian Arab Republic. Thus, according to reports, the HTS terrorists once again are upping the ante on their plans to prepare attacks against Damascus and organizing provocations, including with the use of chemical weapons. As previously, these terrorists are acting on tip-offs from the Western Special Services, which have now been joined by Ukrainians. The special services of the Kiev regime. We are still convinced that the path to stabilization in the Syrian Arab Republic is possible only through stopping the military foreign presence, which is there in violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic, and by a cessation of airstrikes on Syrian territory. Distinguished colleagues, as the briefers have told us today, the humanitarian situation in Syria remains extremely serious. More than 70% of the population needs assistance. The level of malnutrition over the past 5 years has increased threefold, and the cost of living over the last year alone has increased twofold. The people's access to water and clean drinking water could be better, and this is because of serious concerns because of recorded cases of cholera in some areas of Syria. All this proves that the difficult process is there, that the process of establishing recovery in the country is very difficult. The flow of refugees fleeing the hostilities of Israel from Lebanon don't fill us with optimism and places a heavy burden on the Syrian authorities. Over the past 2 months, more than 540,000 people have fled to Syria from Lebanon, and most of those are fleeing to the areas under Damascus's control. This clearly shows that people feel safe where the rule of law reigns, as opposed to terrorist disorder and anarchy. These figures speak for themselves, as if however our Western partners try and present the situation otherwise. We welcome the efforts of the Syrian government and local communities that are doing all they can to ensure the basic needs of the new arrivals. There have been entry rules simplified. There are temporary shelters that have been set up, and work to educate people is underway. Local authorities are helping the UN and NGOs to work at the border crossing points in an unhindered fashion. As regards the broader humanitarian context, then we clearly see the resolve of the Syrian authorities to help all Syrians without exception, including those who are in the areas not under government control. Damascus once again extended, up until the 13th of February, authorization to use the border crossing point Bab al-Salam and Arai to bring in assistance from Türkiye. Bab al-Khawa is also continuing to work. We would urge the humanitarian organizations, OCHA and the UN Secretariat to take into consideration Damascus' constructive approach and to step up work on providing necessary assistance inter alia by hosting refugees. It's important for UN structures to bolster their cooperation with local authorities and to coordinate as much as possible with them on the ground in full compliance with the internationally recognized humanitarian principles. There's no place here for politicization when we're talking about assisting people whose right to development and dignified lives exist. humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, coordination, the principle of consent. This should be the very basis of the work of the UN. Especially because the Syrian authorities not only totally openly state that they're prepared to cooperate based on this, but their actions prove it as well. And right now, unfortunately, we don't see any breakthrough from the UN in that particular area at the moment. Cross-line routes for the supply of humanitarian assistance have still not been established. Work with donors is not rendering the needed results. The humanitarian appeal is financed to the tune of only 28%. The disgraceful UN Secretariat parameters and principles for humanitarian assistance in Syria that play into the anti-Damascus narrative of the Western countries has not been recalled. Furthermore, we know that the UN Secretariat has published a new, very categoric in terms of its contents, a new document, namely the Early Recovery Strategy for Syria 2024-2028. At first glance, it obviates the need for getting consent from the Syrians to implement relevant projects in the territory of their own country. Instead of that, the document refers to the fact that the UN has the right to conclude contracts with any local partners and attract financing to two separate funds for the areas under the government's control and the areas not under the government's control. We still need to examine how this strategy is going to impact the humanitarian work of the UN in Syria. And we will give you our views later on. There's something else that is directly linked with the dire situation facing the Syrians. It is the trauma of the sanctions that have been unfurled against the Syrians. Once again, we would urge the UN representatives not to ignore the fact of the negative impact of illegal sanctions on the socioeconomic situation of the country. In this regard, we would urge everyone to participate in the UN Security Council meeting under the area formula that Russia will conduct on the 25th of November on the humanitarian impact of unilateral coercive measures. Distinguished colleagues, our position on Syrian settlement is unchanged. We are in favor of strict compliance with the provisions of UN Security Council Resolution 2254, proposing a political process conducted by the Syrians themselves with the mediation efforts of the UN, to which there is no alternative. We consistently reiterate the need to continue direct inter-Syrian dialogue within the Constitutional Committee. Its work is at a standstill because of the difficulties in selecting a venue for the meetings. We're convinced that it is the Syrians themselves who should choose this platform in cooperation and conjunction with the Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General on Syria and in coordination with the guarantor states of the Astana format, Russia, Iran and Türkiye. In this regard, we would like to draw attention to the outcome of the 22nd International Meeting on Syria in Astana, conducted with our partners under the Astana process, Iran and Türkiye, on the 11th and 12th of November. During that meeting, in particular, once again, the leading role of this format was highlighted in terms of promoting a sustainable and long-term settlement of the Syrian crisis, given the escalation of tension in the Middle East. Furthermore, on the sidelines of the meeting, there was another meeting of the working group on the release of detainees and hostages, and on the transfer of bodies of those who died, and on the search for the missing. We will continue to work with our partners in the Astana format in the interest of a comprehensive stabilization of the situation in Syria and surrounding Syria. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi and Director Warsonu, for your briefings. And Ms. Zainadine, thank you for your powerful and precise presentation. Your remarks will resonate in this chamber for some time to come. I hope the Assad regime's puppet masters were listening carefully. And as we've heard, the truth clearly struck a nerve. The United States remains deeply concerned about the plight of vulnerable individuals, Syrian, Lebanese, and otherwise, who have been displaced by the current conflict in Lebanon. We are closely monitoring their well-being and treatment, and we applaud the work of UN agencies and other humanitarian partners who are doing their utmost to provide aid to those in need. At the same time, we are concerned by ongoing reports of the Assad regime's abuses, including against Syrians displaced from Lebanon, of Syrians who have faced arbitrary detentions, disappearances, forcible conscription, and death while in regime custody, reportedly due to torture. We are also concerned with the escalation of Russia-backed attacks in northwest Syria that have killed and injured scores. These human rights violations and abuses demonstrate that the regime, which has a long history of oppression, has not changed its ways and is seeking to rehabilitate its image by exploiting humanitarian disasters and regional crises. The reality, colleagues, is that Syria remains unsafe and unsuitable for large numbers of returns. We must reject the flawed notion that certain parts of the country are safe for large-scale returns. The best way to enable the voluntary return of refugees is for the Assad regime to create the conditions needed for return, which will require bold political leadership and inclusive political processes. This includes the elimination of Law 10, as well as accountability for the missing and detained, among others. Refugees must not be expected to return until they see a safe future for themselves and their children. In the meantime, we continue to support UNHCR's efforts to improve the protection environment in Syria for over 500,000 people it estimates have crossed from Lebanon since late September. As we continue important work to help the most vulnerable refugees, internally displaced persons, and host communities, we once again urge other donors to help fill the significant funding gaps. It is worth repeating that the U.S. sanctions program against the Assad regime contains numerous exemptions and licenses specifically to facilitate humanitarian aid, and that we are committed to working with humanitarian partners to mitigate unintended impacts on their programs. We would also point to Resolution 2664, which established a humanitarian carve-out across UN sanctions regimes. This resolution was an important step forward to ease the delivery of food, medicine, and humanitarian aid to those most afflicted in conflict zones around the globe, while upholding robust sanctions. We are compelled to make this point because the regime and certain council members falsely claim on a repeated basis that U.S. sanctions are the primary cause of Syrians' economic suffering, when in fact it is the Assad regime's war against its own people, destruction of Syria, and long-term and pervasive corruption that only benefits the elites. Separately, we wish to highlight persistent needs at Al-Hol and Raj displaced persons camps, as well as at detention facilities in northeast Syria, housing former ISIS fighters. There are still 42,500 displaced persons and 9,000 foreign terrorist fighters currently residing at those camps and facilities. Ultimately, the only long-term durable solution to the challenges of these displaced persons camps and detention facilities is the repatriation or return of both displaced and detained persons to their areas or countries of origin. Only there can they be effectively rehabilitated and reintegrated into their communities and, where appropriate, prosecuted. Turning to the political process, we continue to support Special Envoy Pedersen's efforts to advance it. To that end, we reiterate that U.S. sanctions will remain in place until there is, at a minimum, concrete, measurable progress toward a political solution in line with Resolution 2254. We underscore this point again and again because we want to see an authentic and sustainable political process. We stress once again that the Assad regime must curb the destabilizing activities of Iran and its proxies in the region. It is telling that instead of sitting down with the opposition and forging peace, the regime prefers to lend out its own country to Hezbollah and other terrorists. It is time for Assad to focus on the needs of his own people, rather than his sponsors in Tehran who wish to use Syria as a launching pad. The United States will continue to support Israel's right to defend itself from threats in Syria. To prevent further escalation and expansion of conflict in the region, the United States will continue working with our diplomatic partners toward resolving tensions. And finally, Mr. President, with regard to charges from some about Western exploitation of Syrian oil and other natural resources, these allegations are patently false. Syria's natural resources are there for the benefit of the Syrian people. The United States neither seizes nor sells any Syrian oil, wheat, or other commodities, including from northeast Syria, where our troops are present. To the contrary, the United States has provided millions of dollars worth of assistance to communities across northeast Syria, helping them restore essential services, generate livelihoods, and build businesses. In fact, it is the regime that owes an explanation to the Syrian people about how its natural resources have been misused. It is they who should explain why the proceeds of the country's sovereign wealth end up not in the hands of average citizens, but in Moscow and Tehran. It is they who should explain why virtually any successful business in regime areas gets shaken down for bribes or forcibly sold off to regime cronies. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie l'envoyé spécial adjoint Najat Rochdi et la directrice des opérations et du bureau des affaires humanitaires de l'ONU et des pour leur intervention.
for Humanitarian
Je prends
Affairs, Idem
également note de l'exposé de
briefings. I
Mme
also
Sawsan
take
Abou-Saïnedi.
note of
La
Ms.
Suisse soutient
Sawsan
l'engagement des représentantes et
comments.
représentants de la société civile
Switzerland
dans le
welcomes the
processus
commitment of civil
politique
society
et en
representatives
faveur
to
de la
the political
réconciliation
process and to
entre Syriennes et
reconciliation
Syriens.
among Syrians.
Un engagement pour la paix à tous les niveaux
A
est
commitment
en
to
effet
peace at all
nécessaire.
levels
La
is
Suisse
indeed
condamne
necessary.
l'escalade de violence en cours et
Switzerland
le
condemns
fait
the
que
current
de plus en plus de
escalation of
civils
violence and the
et de
fact
biens à
that
caractère
more and more
civil
civilians
soient
and
touchés
civilian
par des
property
bombardements
are
ou
being
d'autres types
impacted by
d'attaques sur
bombings and
l'ensemble du
other
territoire syrien.
attacks throughout
Il faut mettre
Syria.
fin à cette spirale de violence.
This spiral of
La Suisse
violence
s'engage
must
pour que
end.
toutes les parties au conflit
Switzerland is
respectent leurs
committed to
obligations
ensuring that
en
all
vertu du
parties
droit
to the conflict
international,
respect their
y
obligations under
compris du
international
droit
law,
international humanitaire.
including international
Cela
humanitarian law.
comprend en particulier
This
les
includes
principes
in
de
particular the
distinction,
principles of distinction,
proportionnalité et
proportionality,
précaution
and
dans la
precaution
conduite des
in the
hostilités.
conduct of
Les violations
hostilities.
graves du droit international
Serious
en Syrie
violations of
ne
international
doivent
law
pas
in
rester
Syria
impunies.
must not go
La
unpunished.
Suisse se joint aux appels de l'envoyé spécial contre
Switzerland
l'extension en
joins in the
Syrie
special
des
envoy's
hostilités en
calls against
cours
the
au
extension to
Proche-Orient et
Syria
au
of the
Liban voisin,
hostilities
ainsi
underway
que
in the
pour
Middle
une
East and
résolution
neighboring
durable du
Lebanon,
conflit
and
sur la
calls for a
base
lasting
de la
resolution of the
résolution
conflict on the basis of
2254.
Resolution
Nous prenons note des
2254.
récentes déclarations des
We
États
take
garants
note of the
d'Astana
recent
en
statements
faveur
by
d'une
the
telle
Astana
solution,
guarantor
une
states in
reprise
favor
prochaine
of
des
such a
travaux du
solution,
comité
an
constitutionnel,
imminent resumption
ainsi
of
que
the
la
work of
mise
the
en place d'un
Constitutional Committee, as
cessez-le-feu
well as the
à l'échelle
establishment
nationale
of a
enverrait
nationwide
des signaux
ceasefire
cruciaux
would
en ce
send
sens.
crucial signals in this direction.
Enfin, le droit de savoir des proches des personnes disparues en raison des conflits armés est une
Finally,
règle
the
solidement
right of
ancrée dans les
relatives
conventions
to
de
know
Genève.
the fate of
Il est
missing
également
persons
un
as a
élément
result of armed
essentiel en
conflict
vue
is a
d'une paix
rule firmly
durable en
anchored
Syrie.
in the Geneva Conventions.
L'institution
It is also
indépendante
an
pour les
essential
personnes
element in
disparues signe à
achieving
Genève, dont le
lasting
mandat
peace
est
in
strictement
Syria. The
humanitaire,
independent
doit pouvoir
institution for
commencer
missing
son travail
persons based in
rapidement
Geneva, whose
en
mandate is strictly
collaboration avec les
humanitarian,
organisations des
must be
proches
able
des
to begin
personnes
its work
détenues et
rapidly in
disparues,
collaboration with
ainsi
the
qu'avec tous les
organization of
acteurs concernés en
relatives
Syrie
of detained
et
and
au
missing
niveau
persons,
international.
and with all actors concerned in
Monsieur le
Syria
Président,
and
après
at the
13 ans de
international
conflit,
level.
la
Mr.
situation
President,
continue
after
de se
13 years of
détériorer.
conflict, the
Les
situation
Syriens et
continues to
Syriennes en paient le
deteriorate.
prix.
Syrians are
Malheureusement, au fil
paying
des
the
mois, la
price.
situation humanitaire
Unfortunately, as the
continue de
months
se
go by, the
dégrader.
humanitarian
Insécurité
situation
alimentaire,
continues to
accès
worsen.
aux soins,
Food
les besoins
insecurity,
essentiels ne
access to
cessent
health care,
d'augmenter.
essential
Dans les
needs
mois
are
à venir,
constantly on the rise.
ceux-ci seront
In the coming
exacerbés par
months,
les
these
rigueurs de
needs will be
l'hiver. En
exacerbated by
parallèle,
the harsh winter.
l'intensification des
At the
violences
same
sur
time,
l'ensemble
the
du territoire
intensification of violence
met au
throughout the
défi le
country
bon
is
déroulement du
challenging the
travail
work
des
of
acteurs
humanitarian
humanitaires sur le
actors
terrain.
on the ground.
Face à ces besoins aigus,
in the face
toutes
of
les
these acute
modalités d'accès
needs,
aux personnes
all
dans le
means of
besoin,
access to
à
people in
travers les
need,
lignes de
across the
front, à
front
travers
lines,
les
across the
frontières
borders,
et à
and
l'intérieur de la
inside
Syrie,
Syria,
doivent être
must be
exploitées.
used.
Nous saluons la poursuite des opérations
We
humanitaires de
welcome
l'ONU
the
via les
continuation
points
of
de
UN
passage de Bab el-Salam
humanitarian
et
operations
d'El-Rey, dont l'utilisation a
via
été
the Bab
autorisée pour 3
al-Salam
mois
and Al-Ray
supplémentaires.
crossing
Nous
points,
appelons
which
le
have been
gouvernement syrien à
authorized for
prolonger
use for
ces
a further 3
autorisations,
months.
y
We
compris
call on the
celles
Syrian
pour Bab
government to
el-Hawa,
extend these
sans limite dans le
authorizations,
temps.
including that for
Cela
Bab
afin de
al-Hawa, without
garantir la
any time
prévisibilité
limit.
nécessaire
This is
pour
to
un engagement
ensure the
humanitaire intégral
predictability
et
needed for a
efficace.
full and effective
Et parce qu'il
humanitarian
s'agit d'une
commitment,
obligation
and it
selon le
is an
droit international
obligation under
humanitaire.
international humanitarian
Par
law.
ailleurs, la poursuite des opérations militaires d'Israël au
Moreover,
Liban a déjà
Israel's
entraîné la
continuing
fuite de
military
plus d'un
operations in
demi-million de
Lebanon have
personnes
already
vers la Syrie.
resulted in more than
La Suisse
500,000
appelle à ce
people
que
fleeing
tout
to
soit mis en
Syria.
œuvre pour leur protection.
Switzerland calls for everything
Ces
possible
personnes
to be done
ainsi
to
que les
protect them.
communautés d'accueil
These
parmi
people
lesquelles
and the
elles
host
trouvent
communities
refuge
in which they
sont
find
très
refuge are
vulnérables.
very
À cet
vulnerable.
effet, la Suisse
To
appelle le
this
gouvernement
end,
syrien et
Switzerland
les
calls on the
principaux
Syrian
acteurs
government and the
humanitaires
main
à
humanitarian
apporter un
actors
soutien et une
to provide
protection
greater
accrue
support and
aux
protection
déplacés
for displaced
comme aux
persons
communautés hôtes.
and host communities alike.
La population syrienne doit
The Syrian
bénéficier d'une aide
population must
humanitaire
benefit from
inconditionnelle et
unconditional and
dépolitisée. À cet
depoliticized
égard, je suis
humanitarian
heureux de
aid.
confirmer que
In
la
this
Suisse
respect, I am
contribue à
pleased to
hauteur de
confirm
plus d'1
that
million de
Switzerland
dollars
is
pour la Syrie
contributing more than
à
$1
l'appel
million for
interagence
Syria
d'urgence de l'ONU
to the UN
qui s'ajoute
Emergency
à son
Interagency
engagement
Appeal,
régulier.
in addition to its regular commitment.
Monsieur le Président, le monde nous a laissé
President,
tomber 2 fois,
the
nous
world
les Syriens, a
has let
déclaré Ismaël
Syrians down
al-Nasser, Syrien de
twice,
35
said
ans,
Ismail
ayant fui la
al-Nasser, a
Syrie il y a 13 ans,
35-year-old Syrian
et le
who fled
Liban en
Syria
octobre.
13 years ago,
Nous avons le
and
devoir de
Lebanon
ne
in
pas les
October.
abandonner
We
une
have a
fois de
duty
plus.
not to let them
Je vous
down
remercie.
again. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to begin by thanking Deputy Envoy Rojdi and Director Vosorno for their briefings. I would also like to thank Mrs. Zainedine for her valuable contribution today. Mr. President, the ongoing tense and violent situation across many fronts in Syria is highly worrying, especially in combination with the escalation of violence in the wider region. The war in Gaza and the ongoing hostilities in Lebanon in particular. We urge all major stakeholders to redouble their efforts towards regional de-escalation in the interest of long-term peace and stability for all. In this growing regional turmoil, the implications for Syria and Syrians are alarming. Moreover, this is happening on our watch. Once again, tens of thousands of Syrians, many of whom have been displaced multiple times, are fleeing for their lives. Once again, they're forced to relive the nightmare of displacement, despair, and uncertainty. Most of those who are returning back to Syria are doing so under aversive conditions and extreme pressure. These people, women, children, and older persons in particular, are in a situation of acute vulnerability and have immense and urgent needs. In light of the situation unfolding, we call on the Syrian government to prioritize the welfare of all people on its territory with no distinction between them on religious, sectarian, ethnic, or political grounds. Enhancing cooperation with UNHCR would be a necessary step in order to ensure full humanitarian and protection needs for all. We call also on the Syrian government and de facto authorities on the ground to ensure long-term safety of the returnees. Mr. President, the Syrian crisis remains one of the world's worst and most enduring humanitarian situations. The current displacement influx from Lebanon adds an additional strain on the response. Almost 17 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. On top of that, with only a month left in the year, the humanitarian response plan for Syria is only at 28%, as mentioned by Director Vosorno earlier. We echo the appeal of humanitarians to urgently and significantly increase support for humanitarian efforts in Syria. In addition, to cope with the scale of the situation, all forms of aid delivery, including cross-border aid and aid delivered across the front lines, remain crucial. Humanitarian actors need greater predictability to plan their activities, and they must be able to conduct their work safely. As the situation is becoming more dangerous and unpredictable with each passing day, we call on all actors, Syrian and international, including Israel, to comply with international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Mr. President, in conclusion, we reiterate our full support to Special Envoy's efforts and we call on the Syrian government to engage in a political process towards a sustainable and comprehensive political solution in line with United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Deputy Special Envoy Ms. Rushdie and OCHA Director Ms. Wosorn for their informative briefings. I also thank Ms. Sosan for her very powerful remarks. The conflict in Lebanon that has escalated since September continues to have a profound impact on Syria, with 540,000 Syrians and Lebanese reported to have entered the country, 75% of whom are women and children. In addition, Israeli airstrikes on targets inside Syria have escalated, resulting in an increase in civilian casualties. Conflict in Gaza and Lebanon must not spill over into the entire region and cause further tragedy. Japan once again calls for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. We also urge all parties to exercise maximum restraint and work diligently toward a diplomatic solution in order to avoid further escalation in the region. Japan has done its utmost to provide assistance to those facing difficulty. On October 29th, in response to the deteriorating situation in Syria affected by conflict in Lebanon, the government of Japan decided to provide a new emergency grant aid, which amounts to $10 million. Through this financial outlay, we will provide humanitarian assistance such as daily necessities, food, water, and sanitation through UNHCR, WFP, UNICEF, and UNDP. Mr. President, even putting the spillover from Lebanon aside, the humanitarian situation in Syria remains extremely serious. According to the UN, contributions to the humanitarian response plan are only 28% of what was requested. As to the problems caused by Lebanon crisis, only 17% of the emergency appeal announced in September has been collected. We continue to call on all donors to provide whatever assistance they can to address urgent need of the population. If the necessary funds are not raised before winter sets in, the people of Syria could face even harsher conditions. While we must deal with other pressing issues, we must not abandon Syrian people. Mr. President, we emphasize that the only solution to the political stalemate in Syria is to advance Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process. It is regrettable that more than 2 years have passed since the last meeting of the Constitutional Committee and people's expectation waning, so we strongly urge that the meeting be held as soon as possible. In this connection, we note that the 22nd meeting of the Astana process was held in November 11 to 12 in Kazakhstan. We hope that this process will promote confidence building among the parties concerned. Also, we note that Special Envoy Pedersen is currently visiting the region, including Damascus, and we hope that meaningful discussions will take place with stakeholders. Mr. President, it is unacceptable that the tragic situation of Syrian people continues due to the deadlock in the political process. We call on all parties to resolve the conflict through dialogue so that the flames that are rising in the region can be extinguished and the Syrian people and other innocents can return to living in peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I thank Deputy Special Envoy Rushdie and Director Wosorn for their briefings, and I also thank Ms. Zainuddin for sharing her powerful testimony with us today. The Syrian people, already profoundly vulnerable after enduring 14 years of conflict, need peace, stability, and political support more than ever. Yet, the region remains on the precipice. Just last week, airstrikes in Damascus claimed 15 lives and injured 16 more. Additional reports indicate that at least 36 people have been killed in strikes on Palmyra on Wednesday. Airstrikes in Lebanon have resulted in the displacement of nearly 500,000 people across the border into Syria. We have seen reports detailing engineering and construction work along the Alpha Line, encroaching into the area of separation. These are reported violations of the UNDF agreement. Such actions escalate tensions and potentially threaten the viability of this 50-year-old ceasefire. Mr. President, the humanitarian needs arising from Syria's protracted conflict are immense. Over 16.7 million people, including 7.4 million children, are in urgent and critical need of support. In this vein, we are deeply concerned with the humanitarian situation in northeast Syria, including reports of large-scale attacks targeting civilian infrastructure. This has resulted in disruptions to the provision of electricity and water, directly impacting civilians. We commend the efforts of the UN and its partners in reaching millions across Syria each month. Nevertheless, we regret the chronic underfunding of the humanitarian response plan. Put simply, there are no further reductions that can be made without undermining the UN's ability to respond. Urgent and increased support, particularly in early recovery, livelihoods, and resilience programming, is essential to preserve life and dignity in Syria. We stress the importance of adopting a whole-of-Syria approach in our early recovery to make sure that humanitarian aid is not weaponized by the regime. The most direct routes, both cross-border and cross-line, must be facilitated by all parties for as long as humanitarian needs persist. This is particularly critical as we approach the harsh winter months. In this regard, we welcome the renewal of the Bab al-Hawa crossing in the north for a 3-month period. Mr. President, the implementation of Resolution 2254 remains paramount. We deeply regret the continued lack of progress on this front. We once again call for the implementation of a nationwide ceasefire to be respected by all parties in the region. Without these steps, we risk a profound unraveling of the fragile foundation for peace. All parties must end their prevarications and commit to the resumption of the Constitutional Committee in Geneva. Malta reaffirms its strong support for the UN's independent institution on missing persons and emphasizes the importance of carrying out its mandate in a gender-responsive and survivor-centered manner. To conclude, Mr. President, after 14 years of war, Syria's future remains hanging by a thread. Its economy, security, and society are in ruins. While millions of Syrian people have fled to nearby Lebanon in that time, fearful of returning, we now see the fear of Israeli bombardment forcing nearly 500,000 to return. This and the threat of a major conflict in the region threaten to push Syria into total collapse. We once again reiterate that our responsibility is to stop this from happening. This is the responsibility of this Council. Those with influence over the parties must ensure that Syrian civilians are protected from devastating conflicts of an all-out regional war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3+, namely Algeria, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and my own country, Guyana. At the outset, the A3+ would like to thank Deputy Special Envoy Najat Rushdie and OCHA Director Edem Wasserno for their valuable briefings. We also listened carefully to the representative of civil society. Mr. President, the escalating tensions in the Middle East is further complicating the path to peace and stability in Syria. Recent developments, including renewed violations of Syria's sovereignty, undermine Syria's fragile stability and exacerbate the suffering of its people. Such actions not only violate international law, but also risk reigniting a devastating cycle of violence and terrorism. The A3+ is deeply alarmed by these developments and underscores the urgent need for all actors in the region to exercise maximum restraint and prioritize dialogue over confrontation. Syria must be spared from further military escalation. The resurgence of terrorism within Syria serves as a stark reminder of the critical importance of a comprehensive political solution to the crisis, one that ensures Syria's unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. The A3+ reaffirms its unwavering support for a Syrian-owned and Syrian-led political process, as outlined in Resolution 2254. In this regard, we emphasize the need to reinvigorate the Constitutional Committee and call on all stakeholders to engage constructively with the Special Envoy to break the current political deadlock. We remain convinced that an inclusive dialogue among Syrians, supported by the international community, is the only viable path to a sustainable and just resolution to this protracted crisis. The A3+ calls on all parties to demonstrate the political will necessary to restore peace and stability in Syria. Mr. President, the dire humanitarian situation in Syria, exacerbated by the influx of refugees from Lebanon, has left an already estimated 16.7 million people in need, while limited funding resources further hinder efforts to address these challenges. 540,000 people have fled to Syria, a high proportion of them female-headed households, placing an additional strain on both the Syrian government and the humanitarian community, which are already struggling to meet their basic needs. The A3+ urges all parties to ensure the security of displaced persons, protect and respect their human rights, and create an environment that allows for the free movement of humanitarian organizations to reach the most vulnerable populations. We express our deep concerns over the insufficient funding for both the Humanitarian Response Plan and the Flash Appeal, and call on donors to honor their commitments in this regard. The A3+ welcomes the decision of the Syrian government to extend for an additional 3 months the authorization granted to the UN and humanitarian agencies to use the Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai crossings. In this regard, we underscore the critical importance of all mechanisms, including the cross-border and cross-line mechanisms, for the effective delivery of humanitarian assistance throughout Syria. The A3+ has consistently advocated for the urgent need for early recovery projects to ensure an effective humanitarian response. Restoring the health system must be a priority, especially in light of the suspected cholera cases in Al-Hasaka, which highlight the urgent need for action. The A3+ calls on all member states to engage positively with the UN efforts to implement an early recovery strategy, including by lifting unilateral sanctions. The future of Syrians depends on creating an environment conducive to their safe, voluntary, and dignified return to their homes. Mr. President, the Middle East stands at a critical crossroads, and we cannot afford to witness the outbreak of another conflict, particularly in Syria, which has already been ravaged by 13 years of crisis. It is imperative that we all work together to prevent the recurrence of violence in Syria and to find a lasting solution to the crisis that continues to shake the country. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, President.
Agradezco a la enviada
We're
especial
grateful
alterna
to the Deputy Special
y a la
Envoy
directora
Rochi
Wosurno
and Director
por la información
Wosurno
proporcionada.
for the information they
He
provided.
tomado debida nota de
I've
la
taken due
intervención de la
note of the
representante de la
statements made
sociedad
by
civil.
the representative of civil
Saludo la
society,
presencia de los
and I
representantes
also welcome the
permanentes de
presence
Siria,
of permanent
Irán y Turquía.
representatives from Syria, Iran, and
Señor
Turkey in
presidente,
the
en
room.
esta ocasión quisiera
Mr. President,
abordar nuevamente
on
tres
this
aspectos que
occasion,
preocupan a
once
mi
again, I would
delegación
like to
sobre la
address three
situación en
aspects of
Siria.
concern to my delegation
Primero,
regarding the
sobre
situation
el
in Syria.
estancamiento de la negociación
Firstly,
política
on the
y la falta de
stalemated
voluntad de las
political
partes para
negotiations and the
explorar
lack of will
cualquier
shown by the
escenario
parties
alternativo,
to
mi
explore any
delegación subraya
other
que la única
scenario,
solución
my
posible
delegation
para la
underscores
situación
the
en
fact that
Siria
the
es
only
política,
possible
por lo que
solution
hoy,
to the
más que
situation
nunca,
in Syria
están
is
vigentes los
political.
dispositivos
For
de la
that reason,
resolución
today more than ever, the
2254.
provisions of Resolution
El Comité Constitucional
2254
como
remain
estrategia integral
relevant.
de diálogo
The
entre el gobierno,
Constitutional Committee,
oposición,
as the
sociedad civil
comprehensive
y
strategy
otros
for
países
dialogue between the
interesados
government, the
debe
opposition, and civil
ser
society
reactivado
and
sin
other
dilación.
interested countries
Animamos
must
al
be
enviado especial
revived without delay.
Pedersen a no cesar
We
en las
encourage
gestiones
Special Envoy
diplomáticas
Pedersen
para
to
determinar
spare no
una
diplomatic
sede
efforts to
alternativa para
find
el
an
Comité
alternative
Constitucional.
venue for the Constitutional Committee.
Se configura una nueva crisis humanitaria
a new
con el
humanitarian
incremento en el
crisis
número
is
de
looming
personas
with an
forzadas
increase
a
in the number of
desplazarse
persons
entre
forcibly
sirios,
displaced,
palestinos y
including
libaneses.
Syrians, Palestinians, and
El 75%
Lebanese.
de desplazados son mujeres,
75% of
niños
the
y personas con
IDPs
discapacidad,
are women and
cuyos
children
niveles
and
de
persons with
exposición y
disabilities,
vulnerabilidad
and their
se
levels of
incrementan
exposure
frente a
and
la exacerbación de las
vulnerability have
tensiones.
risen with the worsening
Estos
tensions.
desplazamientos agravan
These
la situación que
displacements
enfrenta el
exacerbate
país,
the
donde
situation
2
in the
de cada
country
3
where 2
personas
out
se
of
encuentran
every
en
3
en
people
necesidad de
is in
asistencia
need of
humanitaria para
humanitarian
sobrevivir.
assistance just to survive.
La comunidad internacional debe
The
responder al
international
llamamiento de
community must
emergencia de Naciones
respond
Unidas
to the UN
por
emergency
324
appeal
millones
for
de dólares adicionales
$324
para
million
enfrentar las
additional
necesidades
dollars in order
emergentes
to
del
address
plan de
emerging
respuesta
needs
humanitaria.
in the humanitarian
Los
response
cruces
plan.
fronterizos de Bab al-Salam
The
y
Bab
al-Rai
al-Salam
se
and
encuentran
al-Rai
operativos
crossings
hasta el 13 de febrero
will
del
remain
2025.
operational until the 13th
El
of
compromiso
February
del gobierno sirio en
2025.
esta
The
área
commitment of
debe
the
ser
Syrian government
permanente para
here
garantizar
must
la
remain
predictibilidad
steadfast in order
y
to guarantee
sostenibilidad
predictability
de
and
la asistencia
sustainability
humanitaria.
of
Y
humanitarian
tercero,
assistance.
las
And
repercusiones
third,
del conflicto
the
regional
repercussions
ya
of the
muestran
regional
el temido
conflict
efecto
have
contagio
already
con la escalada
shown
de
the
violencia en
feared
territorio
knock-on
sirio.
effect with an escalation of violence
Preocupa además a
in
mi
Syrian
delegación la
territory.
extrema
My
sensibilidad
delegation is
de la
concerned
situación
about
en
the
la región
extremely
y la
sensitive
resistencia
situation in
de
the
las
region
partes para hacer
and the
gala de
reluctance of the
moderación y
parties to show
contención.
moderation and constraint.
Señor presidente,
Mr. President,
13 años después
13
de iniciado
years
el conflicto
after
en
the
Siria y
start
después
of the
de todos los
conflict in
esfuerzos de la
Syria
comunidad
and after
internacional
all the efforts
para
by the
apoyar
international
un
community to
proceso
support an
intrasirio de
intra-Syrian
establecimiento de la
process
paz,
to restore
es
peace,
tiempo de darle
it is now
oportunidad a la
time to
concertación,
give dialogue a
única vía
chance.
para
This is the
alcanzar
only way
la
to
paz y
ensure
seguridad en
peace and
Siria
security in
y desde
Syria,
ahí irradiar
and
la
in
paz
this
a la
way to
región
allow
entera.
peace to
Muchas
spread
gracias.
throughout the entire region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr.
je remercie Mesdames Rochdi et Wozornou pour leurs interventions, ainsi que Madame Abou Zaineddine pour son exposé très éloquent et surtout pour son action en faveur du peuple syrien. Après bientôt 14 ans de guerre et le refus de Damas de prendre en compte les aspirations légitimes du peuple syrien, la perspective d'un embrasement régional qui pourrait s'étendre à la Syrie doit être évitée. Les tensions actuelles font peser de nouvelles contraintes sur les populations qui s'ajoutent à la recrudescence des actions de Daesh, au trafic de Captagon et la poursuite des violences du régime et de ses soutiens contre la population. La France n'a cessé de le répéter. Un processus politique crédible, répondant aux aspirations des Syriens, reste la seule manière de parvenir à la paix. Elle réaffirme son soutien à Gert Peterson et à la mise en œuvre de la résolution 2254 dans toutes ses composantes. Elle est prête, à la condition de progrès du processus politique, à entamer la levée des sanctions et le financement de la reconstruction. La fuite de plus d'un demi-million de Libanais et de Syriens du Liban vers la Syrie montre l'impact des tensions régionales. Toutes ces personnes doivent pouvoir bénéficier d'aide et de garanties de sécurité. À cet égard, la France est préoccupée par l'arrestation et la disparition forcée et d'autres graves violations des droits des Syriens revenus du Liban. Nous devons collectivement faire pression sur le régime pour qu'il lève les obstacles au retour des réfugiés. C'est le sens du travail engagé par la France avec le HCR et ses partenaires. La situation humanitaire reste très dégradée. L'hiver va davantage éprouver une population épuisée par plus de 13 années de guerre. Les plus vulnérables vont être touchés par le froid. Une grande partie de la population est en proie à la faim. Dans ce contexte, il est indispensable de continuer à financer l'aide, mais aussi à se mobiliser pour permettre l'acheminement de celle-ci. La France finance en 2024 un projet pilote du Programme alimentaire mondial visant à garantir un accès abordable au pain pour 250 000 personnes dans le Nord-Ouest. À ce titre, elle rappelle le caractère vital de l'acheminement transfrontalier de l'aide et elle appelle le régime syrien à autoriser l'utilisation sans limite dans le temps des points de passage de Bab el-Salam, Al-Rai et de Bab el-Awa. En même temps, il est impératif de poursuivre les efforts pour permettre l'acheminement de l'aide à travers les lignes de front. La France rappelle que le droit international humanitaire s'impose à tous les acteurs partout en Syrie.
Humanitarian law must be upheld by all
Representative of
stakeholders
France
in
for their
Syria.
statement. And I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Deputy Special Envoy Rashidi, Director Wasronu, for their briefings. I also convey my special gratitude to Ms. Zainedine for her testimonies, which were truly inspiring. It is deeply worrisome that the security situation in Syria has further worsened ever since the last briefing. The escalation over the past week, including intense airstrike in Damascus, northeast Syria, and Palmyra, show no sign of abating. In this context, I would like to make the following 3 points. First, we reiterate our call for all parties to recommit to the political process outlined in Resolution 2254. While Syria's security landscape is deeply interconnected with regional dynamics, the political process under the resolution remains the only agreed-upon framework for achieving sustainable peace in the country. As such, we urge all parties to uphold the principles enshrined in the resolution, including the preservation of territorial integrity and the protection of the rights of all Syrians. Second, we call on Syria to provide answers to the families of missing and arbitrarily detained persons regarding their fate. Ensuring the human rights of all Syrians is more crucial than ever, particularly with the anticipated arrival of more refugees from Lebanon. Yet, progress on addressing the critical issue of detained and the missing persons remains limited, despite the passage of time. In this context, we acknowledge the recent report of the Independent Institution on Missing Persons, IIMP, which outlines its notable achievements since its establishment last April. We commend the IIMP for its steadfast efforts in clarifying the fate of missing persons through extensive outreach and engagement. However, it is deeply concerning that the IIMP has not yet appointed its head, despite the 6 months of operational activity. We reiterate our call for the immediate appointment of its leadership, as such progress will serve as a vital confidence-building measure and advance Special Envoy Peterson's step-by-step approach. Third, the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Syria demands both immediate and long-term responses. A cholera outbreak, alarming food insecurity, and approaching winter exemplify the urgent need for the international community to address the funding gap currently filled at only 28%. In this context, the Republic of Korea has contributed $26 million to support the Syrian refugees in the region and urges other donor countries to act swiftly to help mitigate escalating crisis. Furthermore, over a decade of humanitarian crisis in Syria highlights the great need for both sustainability and resilience in our efforts. In this regard, we commend OCHA's launch of the Early Recovery Strategy 2024-28, which represent a critical step toward fostering a long-term recovery of the country. In closing, my delegation calls on all parties to urgently cease hostilities, protect the civilians at all costs, and recommit to a political solution that ensures lasting peace, security, and prosperity in Syria. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I wish to thank DSE Rushdie and Director Wosonou for their briefings. Over the past months, Israel has continued to carry out airstrikes against Syria, causing heavy casualties. The actions by Israel gravely violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. China expresses strong condemnation. Such actions must cease immediately. The protracted conflict in Gaza and the escalating situation between Lebanon and Israel have plunged the entire region into uncertainty and instability. In this context, the international community must work together to effectively prevent the further growth and spread of the conflict, as it will lead to even greater disasters. China calls on parties concerned to effectively respect the sovereignty, security, and the territorial integrity of Syria and immediately cease their illegal military actions against Syria. Foreign forces must end their illegal military presence in Syria as soon as possible. The rising tensions between Lebanon and Israel recently has caused an influx of more than 500,000 refugees into Syria, further exacerbating the already dire humanitarian situation there. China applauds the positive actions taken by the UN agencies in their efforts to provide emergency humanitarian assistance to those in need. We welcome the Syrian government's decision to extend the authorization for the relevant border crossings and commend the government's efforts in making proper arrangement to host refugees. We call on the parties to respond positively to the urgent appeals by the humanitarian agencies such as UNHCR, scale up humanitarian input for Syria, honor the donor commitments in a timely manner, and ensure the smooth implementation of the humanitarian projects in Syria so as to help improve the humanitarian situation in the country. China reiterates that the unilateral sanctions imposed against Syria by certain countries should be lifted without delay, and that the illegal plundering of Syrian resources should stop forthwith in order to create favorable conditions for the Syrian economy to recover and develop. President, China firmly supports the general direction of a political solution to the Syrian issue and the comprehensive facilitation of the political process in accordance with the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned principle. We welcome the efforts by Special Envoy Patterson in line with this principle. We look forward to the coordination among various existing dialogue mechanisms and render assistance to the political solution on the basis for communication and consultation with the Syrian government. China firmly supports the Syrian government in its efforts to fight terrorism. We call on the international community to reject double standards in accordance with international law and council resolutions and join hands in the spirit of zero tolerance to support the Syrian government in combating terrorist forces within its borders. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of the United Kingdom. I thank Deputy Special Envoy Rushdie and Director Wosonou for their briefings. I would also like to thank Sorsan Abu Zainuddin for her incredibly powerful testimony today. As we have heard today from Ms. Zainuddin, there is a vibrant community of civil society actors who stand ready to support the Syrian political process, accountability efforts, and humanitarian work with dynamism and tenacity. Where members of this Council have failed to back resolutions in the interests of the Syrian people, civil society actors have stepped in, creatively unblocking issues that have regretfully become politicized. I commend their tireless work to advocate on behalf of Syrians for a better and peaceful Syria, but particularly to lend a voice to those who cannot speak up for fear of the regime. The work of civil society organizations like Madaniya serves as an important reminder of why so many Syrians took to the streets in 2011 and continue to protest peacefully for change. Let me be clear. We remain firm in our pursuit of a political settlement in line with Resolution 2254. We urge all parties to recommit to the political process. However, if we are to achieve lasting peace, we must make sure it empowers ordinary Syrians rather than the regime and its backers. We must actively involve and consult civil society, and I encourage you all to listen to their fresh ideas. Colleagues, in the absence of a political settlement and amidst regional escalation, the security situation in Syria is as dangerous as ever. Syrians continue to experience horrific levels of violence. As people flee from Lebanon into Syria, displaced civilians must be protected and given safe passage, not only when using border crossings, which have been subject to airstrikes, but also once inside Syria, which remains unsuitable for safe, dignified, and voluntary returns at scale. We acknowledge that Syrian authorities have allowed UNHCR and others to monitor arrivals and respond to needs. We are closely monitoring the treatment of these civilians in Syria, including deeply concerning reports of arrests. All parties must do everything possible to protect civilians and fully comply with international humanitarian law. Finally, to respond to the remarks of our Russian colleague about briefers, we invite civil society briefers to the Council to provide a civilian perspective, to speak truth to power, and to hold us all to account, no matter how uncomfortable that may feel. Representing an organisation that consults across a wide group of over 200 CSOs within and outside Syria, Ms. Abu Zainuddin has done precisely that today. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
السيد الرئيس، يواصل كيان الاحتلال الإسرائيلي اعتداءاته الوحشية على دول منطقتنا وشعوبها، وقد شجعه عجز مجلس الأمن عن النهوض بمسؤولياته على مواصلة وتكثيف اعتداءاته الآثمة على أراضي بلاده، حيث أصبح يستهدف بشكل شبه يومي مبانٍ وأحياء سكنية تضم مقرات وبعثات دبلوماسية ومكاتب للأمم المتحدة، كما يستهدف منشآت اقتصادية وبنى تحتية، مما أدى لارتقاء العشرات وإصابة مئات من المدنيين الأبرياء بما فيهم النساء والأطفال، وإلحاق دمار وخسائر مادية كبيرة في الممتلكات العامة والخاصة، ناهيك عن استهداف كيان الاحتلال المتعمد للمعابر الحدودية والطرق والجسور الواصلة بين سوريا ولبنان التي يستخدمها مئات الآلاف من القادمين من لبنان هربا من آلة القتل الإسرائيلي. وفي انتهاك فاضح لاتفاق فض الاشتباك لعام 1974 تستمر قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي بشن عدوانها على الأراضي السورية من جهة الجولان السوري المحتل، وقد أقدمت مؤخرا على حفر خنادق ورفع سواتر ترابية بمحاذاة خط وقف إطلاق النار في القسمين الشمالي والجنوبي من منطقة الفصل. وقد أجرت قيادة الأوندوف تحقيقات بشأن قيام قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي بأعمال هندسية تشمل حفر خندق يمتد لمسافة 350 متراً وبعرض 6 أمتار، وغيرها من الانتهاكات مثل أعمال تجريف الأراضي الزراعية وشق الطرق. لقد أبلغ وفد الجمهورية العربية السورية الأمانة العامة للأمم المتحدة بهذه الانتهاكات، كما قامت بعثة الأوندوف بتقديم تقريراً عنها. واليوم نحذر مرة أخرى من خطورة هذه الأفعال الإسرائيلية العدوانية التي تهدف لخلق واقع جديد في المنطقة، ونتوقع رد فعل مناسب من مجلس الأمن يتمثل في تحركه الفوري لاتخاذ إجراءات حازمة فورية لوقف العدوان ووضع حد لجميع الانتهاكات التي تقوم بها قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ضد الأراضي السورية وما يتفرع عنها من جرائم. تلك الجرائم التي كان آخرها يوم أمس حيث ارتكب كيان الاحتلال الإسرائيلي جريمة مروعة من خلال شنه لعدوان جوي
where US troops are illegally present, targeting several buildings in Palmyra and the Syrian desert, killing 36 people and injuring dozens, while also causing significant material damage to the targeted buildings and surrounding areas. The Syrian Arab Republic reaffirms its inalienable, inherent right to defend its sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, and to reclaim its occupied territories, a right guaranteed by international law. Mr. President, the escalation of Israeli acts of aggression on Syrian territories is coupled with an intensification of attacks by terrorist groups, especially Jabhat al-Nusra Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, listed by the Security Council. This is a clear indication of the organic ties and close collaboration between these terrorist groups and the Israeli entity to commit criminal acts, including shelling civilians in surrounding areas with drones and rockets. In northern eastern Syria, these groups continue to impose their extremist ideologies and terrorist practices such as killing, torture, enforced disappearances, child recruitment, and violence against women and girls, taking advantage of the support they receive from some Western states. Mr. President, the United States and Türkiye continue to violate Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity. They continue to violate the UN Charter and international law by insisting to maintain their illegal military presence on Syrian soil. At the same time, they are supporting separatist and terrorist groups and looting Syrian national resources at the expense of the Syrian people. The Syrian Arab Republic stresses the need to respect its sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity, and emphasizes the need for an immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all foreign military forces illegally present on its territory. Mr. President, the brutal Israeli aggression on Lebanon, on brotherly Lebanon, has led to a massive wave of displacement. The Syrian Arab Republic opened its doors and mobilized its resources to welcome hundreds of thousands of Lebanese displaced persons, Syrian returnees, and third-country nationals. To date, around 600,000 people have entered Syria, 71% of whom are Syrians. The Syrian government, in collaboration with the United Nations, humanitarian partners, and civil, including the UNHCR and OCHA, and other humanitarian partners and civil society organizations, continues to provide them with the necessary services despite the significant challenges and difficult circumstances it is facing. In this vein, we call for supporting our humanitarian response efforts and providing adequate funding, while also fulfilling the relevant appeals launched by the United Nations and its specialized agencies. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the large number of Syrians returning from Lebanon to Syria and the multifaceted facilitations provided by the Syrian government, which we have repeatedly explained, though some have turned a deaf ear, unequivocally refute Western claims about the return of Syrian refugees. It is high time for certain states to stop repeating such unrealistic allegations and outdated conditionalities.
حرصها على تحسين الوضع الإنساني والمعيشي للسوريين في جميع أنحاء البلاد. وانطلاقا من ذلك فقد جددت حكومة بلادي الإذن الممنوح للأمم المتحدة باستخدام معبرين باب السلامة والراعي لثلاثة أشهر إضافية حرصا منها على إيصال المساعدات لمستحقيها من المدنيين السوريين في شمال غرب سوريا. تشدد بلادي على وجوب دعم صمود السوريين كافة بمن فيهم العائدين وذلك من خلال الانخراط الجاد والملموس في تنفيذ مشاريع التعافي المبكر وسبل العيش وتوفير الخدمات الأساسية وكذلك إنهاء مفاعيل ما تتسبب به ما تسمى بورقة المبادئ والمعايير الناظمة لعمل الأمم المتحدة في سوريا بالغة العدائية والتي تعرف أيضا باسم ورقة فيلتمان. فهذه الورقة
It is completely antagonistic and it goes against basic humanitarian principles. It deprives most vulnerable groups, particularly women and children, of adequate living conditions.
تؤكد سوريا أيضا على ضرورة الرفع الفوري والكامل وغير المشروط للتدابير الانفرادية القصرية اللا
which
ولا أخلاقية ولا شرعية
They are illegal and unethical, and they represent a collective punishment on Syrians and deprive them of their most basic needs.
سيد الرئيس
Mr. President,
لقد أكد البيان الختامي للقمة العربية الإسلامية المشتركة
the recent Arab Islamic Summit hosted by the brotherly kingdom of Saudi Arabia a few days ago strongly condemned Israeli aggression against Syria.
وطالبت القمة مجلس الأمن بتحمل مسؤولياته واتخاذ الإجراءات اللازمة والحازمة لوقف جرائم الاحتلال وتنفيذ قرارات المجلس ذات الصلة لإنهاء الاحتلال الإسرائيلي للأراضي العربية بما فيها الجولان العربي السوري المحتل. أشير أيضا إلى انعقاد الاجتماع 22
I would also like to highlight the 22nd meeting of the guarantor states on Syria in the Astana format held in the capital of Kazakhstan on November 11 and 12.
حيث أكد البيان الختامي الصادر عن الاجتماع على الالتزام الراسخ بسيادة الجمهورية العربية السورية ووحدتها واستقلالها وسلامة أراضيها والتصميم على مواصلة العمل معا لمكافحة الإرهاب بجميع أشكاله ومظاهره والوقوف ضد الأجندات الانفصالية التي تهدف إلى تقويض سيادة سوريا ووحدة وسلامة أراضيها. كما أدان البيان الاعتداءات الإسرائيلية المتكررة على الأراضي السورية. إن بلادي سوريا تجدد التزامها بعملية سياسية بقيادة وملكية سورية دون أي تدخل خارجي وفي ظل الاحترام التام لسيادتها ووحدة وسلامة أراضيها. وتؤكد سوريا استمرارها في التعاون والحوار مع المبعوث الخاص ضمن ولايته الميسر وهو حاليا في دمشق وسيجري مباحثات قريبا في وزارة الخارجية والمخبرين. ختاما السيد الرئيس فإننا نأسف لإخفاق رئاسة مجلس الأمن للشهر الجاري
The current president of the Security Council did not respect the procedures.
واستخدامه لخدمة أجنداتها
It used it to serve its own agendas in an attempt to violate a member state for clear targets, namely
من العديد من الوفود ومن ممثلي الأمم المتحدة بجهود الحكومة السورية
and the commitment of the Syrian government, which is opening border crossings, continuing its daily work, and welcoming returnees. The second goal is to
cover up for the crimes of Israel and the support provided by member states, as we have seen yesterday by the US veto of the E10 draft resolution. A resolution that was supported by 14 states. This resolution would have stopped the Israeli aggression. It would have protected the rights of the Palestinian people and saved lives. The goal is clear. In Syria, we have hundreds of civil society organizations. We have thousands of courageous volunteers working night and day in partnership with the Syrian government and state institutions as well as the United Nations. We are proud of them. We are working with them to improve the humanitarian situation and living conditions of the Syrians, to provide the support needed by Syrians. Currently, we are also providing support to Syrians coming from Lebanon at the borders. They are working night and day to provide all the services necessary in line with their capacities and despite the difficult challenges. Unfortunately,
يتم التعتيم على جهودهم
their efforts are being covered up. They are not getting a chance to present their views in front of you, to talk to you about the challenges they are facing on a daily basis because of the politicization of humanitarian work, because of the lack of funding, because of the coercive measures that represent a collective punishment, depriving Syrians of their most basic rights, including the right to electricity, due to the unilateral, of course, sanctions and the continuous U.S. looting of our oil. They are depriving them of their grains. These are realities. But you're not bringing whoever is working on the ground, whoever is working in the humanitarian field on Syrian soil. You are promoting one selective view. This is unacceptable. This is politicization by the Security Council presidency. This is a very selective approach that is not credible, that is not objective. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Mr. President, the situation in Syria remains dire, exacerbated by Israeli escalating violence and aggression across the region. In coordination with terrorist group, Israeli occupying regime is deliberately pursuing a systematic policy aimed at crippling the infrastructure of Syrian Arab Republic. Relentless airstrike and systematic acts of aggression by this regime on Syrian territory have reached unprecedented level, targeting civilians and critical infrastructure. These criminal acts flagrantly violate Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity, international law, and the UN Charter. Regrettably, Israel's impunity is perpetuated by unwavering U.S. support and inaction of the Security Council, as evidenced by yesterday's U.S. veto. This disgraceful veto not only highlights the Security Council failure to uphold its charter-based mandate, but also serves as a U.S.-granted license for occupying regime to continue its carnage in Gaza and Lebanon with full impunity. This has undermined humanitarian affairs and poses a grave threat to regional and global peace. We reiterate once again our call on the Security Council to act decisively to end Israeli impunity. The Council must hold Israel accountable for its violation of international law and ensure the protection of civilians. If left unchecked, Israel's ongoing crime risks igniting a catastrophic war with global repercussions. Mr. President, as highlighted in today's UN briefing, the humanitarian needs in Syria remain immense. Years of foreign occupation, terrorism, and unilateral sanctions has devastated Syria's economy. The United States and its allies persist in their failed policy of inhuman unilateral sanction, using them as a tool for the collective punishment of the Syrian people. These actions are both illegal and morally indefensible and must be lifted immediately. Meanwhile, the United States and certain European countries, such as the United Kingdom, are politicizing humanitarian aid and obstructing international efforts to support Syrian reconstruction. These harmful policies have only prolonged the conflict and exacerbated the suffering of the Syrian people. Furthermore, Israel's relentless strikes on border crossing between Syria and Lebanon have disrupted critical aid deliveries and forced hundreds of thousands to flee. Over 500,000 people have sought refuge in Syria from Lebanon, placing overwhelming on Syrian already overstretched resources and host communities. The humanitarian response to this crisis demands urgent and substantial international support. Despite these immense challenges, the Syrian government continues to demonstrate remarkable resilience. We commend its steadfast efforts to mobilize resources for assisting refugees, including those recently displaced from Lebanon. We also welcome the Syrian government decision to extend the permission for the Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai border crossing for an additional 3 months to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians in northwest Syria. This decision underscores Syria's commitment to alleviating the suffering of its people despite external pressure. The international community must increase support for Syria to address the urgent needs of refugees. Early recovery projects are essential for rebuilding infrastructure and creating conditions for the safe return of refugees and displaced persons. Mr. President, terrorism remains a significant threat in Syria, particularly in Idlib, where terrorist groups continue to operate. Addressing this threat requires full respect for Syrians' sovereignty and territorial integrity. Iran remains firmly committed to the Astana process, which provides a viable framework for resolving the crisis. During the 22nd meeting of the Astana format held on 11 and 12 November in Kazakhstan, the parties reviewed the recent development in Syria and reaffirmed their steadfast commitment to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. They underscored that adherence to these principles is essential for achieving lasting peace and stability in Syria and the broader region. Iran reaffirms its commitment to a political resolution of the Syrian crisis. A political solution led and owned by Syrians is the only viable path to resolving the Syrian crisis. Any sustainable solution must fully uphold Syrians' sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the illegal presence of foreign forces, particularly U.S. forces, halt the exploitation of Syria's natural resources, and cease ongoing support by the U.S. and Israel for terrorist groups. Iran fully supports the resumption of the Constitutional Committee meeting to advance meaningful political dialogue. We also welcome the Special Envoy's active engagement with Syrian authorities, particularly his ongoing visit to Damascus, as a vital step toward fostering progress in political process. The Syrian people deserve peace, dignity, and the opportunity to rebuild their nation free from external interference. Through collective efforts, we can restore peace and stability in Syria and in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I now give the floor to the representative of Türkiye.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Syria remains a central and painful chapter in the ongoing crises affecting the Middle East. While the focus often shifts to emerging crises, the unresolved situation in Syria continues to demand the urgent attention of the international community. The situation in the broader region has worsened the humanitarian crisis and triggered mass displacement. Since the recent escalation of hostilities and Israel's destabilizing actions across the region, we have seen a sharp increase in displacement to Syria. More than 500,000 people have crossed from Lebanon into Syria, according to UNHCR. Alarmingly, 71% of the displaced are Syrians, with women and children making up the majority. Children alone represent over half. In such dire circumstances, the international community must shoulder its responsibilities. Yet, humanitarian efforts remain underfunded. As Director Wosornu has warned, the UN's humanitarian response plan faces critical funding shortfalls, which threaten the ability to deliver life-saving assistance. Donors must step up and avoid any further cuts to funding and support early recovery efforts. The uninterrupted delivery of humanitarian aid remains vital, particularly in view of the new waves of migration that brings an additional strain. Türkiye is fully committed to facilitating these efforts and will continue to ensure assistance reaches to those in need. Mr. President, Türkiye is fully committed to Syria's territorial integrity and unity. Yet, Syria's already bleak humanitarian and political situation is further aggravated by terrorism. The presence of terrorist organizations within Syria undermines the country's unity and territorial integrity while posing a direct threat to Turkey's national security. No country can stand idle by repeated terrorist attacks to its territory and people. Indeed, the October 23rd deadly terrorist attack in Ankara underscored the urgent need to root out terrorist elements in Syria. The terrorists that are members of PKK, YPG, SDF infiltrated Turkey from Syrian territory. I'd like to emphasize that Turkey is entitled to take appropriate measures against this direct and imminent threat in accordance with its inherent right of self-defense. Turkey's counter-terrorism operations exclusively target terrorists and their capabilities, and utmost care is accorded to avoid any harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure. The terrorists that are members of PKK, YPG, SDF, we will continue to counter their efforts against my country. A truly unified effort is needed to combat terrorism in all its forms without distinction. Eliminating these threats is a prerequisite for achieving stability in Syria and the region. Mr. President, the escalating violence in the Middle East threatens to engulf Syria further. It is imperative to insulate Syria from additional destabilizing actions and to work collectively towards a stable and peaceful future. Turkey is fully committed to this goal. We envision a Syria where a real and sustainable national consensus is achieved, with the international community playing a constructive role. A unified security structure is achieved. The safe and dignified return of displaced Syrians are guaranteed, and regional peace is not undermined by the export of instability to neighbors. These objectives cannot be realized without the removal of all terrorist elements, including Daesh and PKK-YPG, from Syrian territory. Equally, the political process must be revitalized in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. Current developments should not distract us from this ultimate goal. We continue our efforts in the Astana format, among others. We also support the efforts of UN Special Envoy Pedersen to reconvene the Constitutional Committee. Mr. President, the Syrian conflict continues to inflict immeasurable suffering. The international community must remain steadfast in its commitment to Syria. My country stands ready to support all initiatives aimed at achieving a credible political solution. We will continue to work with UN agencies and relevant stakeholders to address the humanitarian needs of the Syrian people. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Türkiye for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.